Vladimir is a Russian politician, journalist, historian, filmmaker. He's a Renaissance man. He was formed by the ideas of Soviet dissidents, has been immensely influenced by Boris Nemtsov, from whom I think he inherited one very simple but such a rare principle in politics, that politics can be done with clean hands. And Vladimir is a principled opponent of Vladimir Putin, and despite all the attacks on him, despite having survived 2 assassination attempts carried out by a team of FSB operatives in the service of the Russian state, he refuses to abandon his country, and he refuses to abandon his fight because he believes, truly believes, that the Russian people deserves better and that the Russian people can do better. And in his last statement to the so-called court, when he was sentenced to 25 years of strict regime for high treason, he said that he truly believes that we can walk as a nation, as a people, we can walk this path and get Russia to democracy. He's a visionary, a true visionary, and you know, I've been married to the guy for 20 years, and yet every time he speaks, I'm impressed, I'm in awe. Of course, he's got another much softer side to him as a father to our 3 children. To them, he's a daddy, someone who's so proud, so proud of their achievements. So that's him. We were classmates in Moscow. We went to the same French language school. So he was 10, I was 11 when we met, and then my mother-in-law, of course, future mother-in-law, married an Englishman, and she moved to the UK. And of course, Vladimir was a minor back then. She took him with her, and he finished his school education here and went to Cambridge. But to him, that was not immigration. He never even considered the possibility of immigrating and, you know, assimilating somewhere. In his mind, it was just temporary, and he would, of course, return back home. And the moment he got his bachelor, his degree at Cambridge, he packed his bags and he went straight back to Russia. Vladimir's connection to this country, of course, is considerable and will continue to remain such. He was a kid when he got the British citizenship, of course. He's got many friends here, and then through his work also acquired a lot of, good friends in other places, like the UK Parliament, for example. He still keeps in contact with his friends from his school and university years. It's just that Vladimir is a Russian patriot, and that is absolutely unquestionable. And I know the guy. I mean, I know what our family went through, and despite all of this, he refused to leave Russia. He refused to abandon his fight for a better future for our country. So obviously, it is important to him. You know, he could have stayed in the UK, or he couldn't. He could not have returned to Russia after the poisonings. But to him, that was absolutely unacceptable. That was an unquestionable thing in his life. And when he returned after university, when he returned, when he packed his bags and went back to Moscow, I remember he would say that, well, the UK can do very well without me. It is in Russia that my knowledge, that my skills might be helpful. And it remains the same. He was offered the position of the RTVI bureau chief in Washington, D.C. RTVI used to belong to Gusinsky, Vladimir Gusinsky, one of the exiled oligarchs, and it used to be an independent TV channel back then. They wanted to open a bureau in Washington, and they didn't have anyone there, and they offered this position to Vladimir. Honestly, so we just packed very quickly, and we went. And he began working for RTVI. He spent several years working for this TV channel, but then the ownership of the channel changed. And the first decision was to fire Vladimir. And only slightly later, Boris Nemtsov somehow uncovered the information that the decision to fire Vladimir had come from above. And his credentials at the US Embassy were annulled months before the official decision to fire him was announced, which made it clear to us that it was not, it was something that had been done deliberately. Vladimir and I have been inseparable since our last year in college, and we built a beautiful world, little world, together. Three wonderful, strong, resilient, smart kids, and we've been raising them together. And when I say together, I mean that Vladimir has always been fully present in the picture, even though his work often took him traveling around the world. Whenever he was home, he was fully in. And I don't think there was. I can't think of anything he didn't do with the kids as a father, even when they were babies, you know, like changing diapers, feeding them, putting them to bed, reading to them at bedtime, or taking them to their extracurricular activities. He's done it all. The only thing he was afraid of doing was cutting their nails. He was afraid of cutting their little fingers off. And he says, I can't. So I had to do that part. Then when they got older, every time he'd come back from his trips, we had this thing, we've had it for years in our family, father-son time, father-daughter time. So he would take them one-on-one on those full-day trips when they would spend time together, and just they would completely plan it together, one-on-one, you know, just the two of them. And they, so he would do this with all three of our kids, just separately, so that they could have their daddy to themselves for a full day. It has always been the life of a just normal, you know, normal family, with normal little life challenges. How the kids are doing at school, if they're keeping up with their homework, who has what kind of extracurricular activities, who needs to go to the dentist, who needs to have a physical checkup, all those normal things. And yeah. They say that during different types of crisis, or during wars, kids grow up much quicker. And when I look at our kids, I see this happening. And I understand that this is inevitable. they are exposed to too much, honestly. And we have two teenagers, and as you well know, teenagers nowadays spend a lot of time on social media, and very often they're much more informed than we are. So they know about the war, they have their definite position about the war, they are absolutely, in detail informed about their father's situation, and I don't involve them too much in what I do, but I want to also offer them opportunities to be there and to have an input if they choose so. Our 14-year-old chose to write her final school year essay on political prisoners in the Russian Federation. That was the subject of her choice. I never in any way suggested it. And funnily enough, she didn't let me read it until after it'd been graded by her teacher. And our oldest one, the 17-year-old, recently made her first public speech in support of her father at the US Congress. There was an event in support of her father 2 days after the verdict had been pronounced. She stood in front of a room packed with all those important people, US senators, US congressmen, representatives of, I don't know, maybe a dozen NGOs, and she stood there and made her speech in support of her father, and I could see how her voice, that was small at the beginning, was, growing. And I was looking at her in tears, of course, thinking that this is a grown-up young lady. So I am, and our 11-year-old, in his own way, there's a heartbreaking story, Russian story, about a family being separated. Masha and Alexei Moskalyov. Masha drew an anti-war picture at school. A 13-year-old girl. She was younger when she drew that picture because the story began right after the full-scale invasion had broken out. And she was reported. The police came knocking on their door. They took her father away. Her father is now serving a prison sentence, and she spent a long time in an orphanage. Because the authorities obviously believe that Alexei Moskalyov is somehow unable to raise a strong Russian patriot. I have been absolutely horrified by this story. Basically depriving people of their parental rights as a method of dealing with anti-war protesters. Well, our 11-year-old brings very similar pictures from school. Only, of course, he will not be reported. And I am not afraid of the police knocking on my door. And in that regard, our family is in a much better situation than those families, those Russian parents, those Russian families living back home who send their kids to school knowing that every week at Russian schools begins with a lesson about what's important, where these kids are explained why the aggressive war against Ukraine, but in the words of the Russian authorities, the special operation, the special military operation, is a noble cause. And not to mention, of course, Ukrainian families who have to run to bomb shelters several times a day to hide their kids from bombs. So, with everything, all the horrendous things that are happening in our family's life, I know that there are people who have it much worse. At the very beginning, Vladimir was held in a prison cell with 5 other people, so 5 other, I don't know, petty criminals, I think they were. And and every prison cell in Russian prisons has a TV set. So it's completely Orwellian. So even behind bars, people cannot be left alone. Even behind bars, that propaganda has to be pouring out of those TV sets on a constant basis to continue and continue poisoning. Because, you know, like if propaganda is removed from the picture, after a certain time, looking around themselves, people start asking questions. So that poison has to be constant. So he was sitting in that cell with 5 other guys, and he spent a few weeks there. At the end of that period, and he's allowed to receive books in prison. And his friends or supporters or family members can send him those books through a specific prison system. It's a bookstore, but a specific one, and you can get there. So he has a copy of Vladimir Bukovsky memoirs. So he spent a few weeks in that prison cell with those 5 guys, with a TV set, with propaganda and memoirs by Vladimir Bukovsky. At the end of that period, the entire cell switched from listening to propaganda news to listening to concerts of a Philharmonic Orchestra, and they all read memoirs by Bukovsky. And so at the end of that period, they were discussing the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Russia, the war of aggression, etc. So, of course, the authorities did not like this and moved Vladimir to a different cell right away. And their history repeated itself. And so after a certain time, they realized that he needed to be kept in that isolation, because even in prison, they cannot allow these people to speak up, because they know that they speak the truth and their arguments are reasonable and well-founded, and they can counter propaganda easily like that. The only way for Russia to stop being a threat to itself and everyone else is for it to become a democracy. If we want to see Russia democracy one day, those people, that part of Russian population, that part of Russian civil society that understands what's going on and is trying to fight it with all they've got, has to survive, because they're going to be the ones to rebuild the country from the ruins, to build it from scratch, basically, and to make it into a democracy. And I understand that it is up to us, Russian citizens, to change the political system in our country. But we will not be able to do that without the support and solidarity of the free world, of which we very much want to be part. I am grateful whenever the British government mentions him, talks about him, but I believe that more could be done, and it was truly baffling for me, considering that Vladimir is a British citizen, to see that it was Canada that was the first country to introduce sanctions against his persecutors. This initiative was then followed by the US, and only then, after Vladimir had been sentenced, did the UK introduce those sanctions. So it's quite baffling to me, honestly, why the UK government needs to wait for so long. And in many cases, this is a life or death situation. And I believe that Vladimir's case is one such case. So I see that, but just speaking generally, what I've seen just traveling around the world and speaking on behalf of political prisoners in Russia, and I've been talking about many cases in which people with medical conditions are kept behind bars without receiving proper medical care, like Alexei Gorinov, for example, the first person to be sentenced to 7 years for his anti-war position, or Evgeny Bestuzhev, or Alexander Skochilenko, or others who are kept behind bars for their anti-war position. They are being portrayed as criminals or traitors by the Russian authorities and deprived of proper medical care, which could lead to their death. So, and during my travels, speaking on behalf of these people, I realized that many Western governments, democratic governments, are not equipped to deal with the ever-rising crisis of political prisoners and hostage-taking in the world. And I believe that this situation has to be changed. I know that the UK's position is to, basically not engage. Because they are afraid that if they engage in those cases, then it will give a sort of an incentive to those autocrats around the world to take even more hostages. The problem is that the UK government does not understand that this crisis will be rising, whether they're prepared to deal with it or not. It will continue rising, and I believe that, and besides, I believe it's just, it's morally, it's ethically unacceptable to leave your citizens behind, to leave them rot in those prisons around the world on politically motivated charges, or because they've been taken hostages by some autocrats, because you don't want to give this autocrat an incentive to take another political prisoner. The highest value is human life. And Western democratic leaders whose countries are built on those values of respect for human rights and freedoms can never, ever disregard a human life by leaving a person behind. So I believe that what needs to be done is the US has an office for hostage affairs. And there is a presidential envoy for hostage affairs who deals with such situations. And I believe that because autocrats work together, they watch each other, they learn from each other, they adopt each other's practices, I believe the free world also needs to work together. And the creation of such offices for hostage affairs in other countries will not only help these countries to work in cooperation to solve the already existing cases, but maybe a set of instruments could be created by these offices working together to counter such practices, to prevent them from happening in the future. To not forget about these people. To not forget about people who, like my husband, stand up and fight for the same values, for the same freedoms they are guaranteed here by the democratic UK government. You know, it's Vladimir very often quotes Professor Irwin Cotler, the founder of the Raoul Wallenberg Center in Canada and former Justice Minister of Canada. And he was also the defender of such amazing human rights fighters as Nathan Sharansky or Nelson Mandela. Professor Kotler says that the worst nightmare for the political prisoner is the thought of being forgotten. Because when you face something as monstrous as those autocratic regimes, very often when you're thrown in jail for that, you feel like you're alone, like you've been forgotten by the entire world because you have no contact with the outside world. So I believe that by speaking about political prisoners, by mentioning names and telling their stories, also by writing to them, by, yes, launching campaigns in support of political prisoners, the world will show solidarity with those people who are being persecuted for their political views and for their struggle against autocracies. I am very proud of him, that his strength gives hope not only to many other Russian citizens who reject everything this regime represents and try to fight with everything they've got, but it also gives hope and strength to me. I am inspired by his amazing strength, his resilience, and I will fight for him for as long as it takes to bring him back.